to have you, Cillian. Thank you so much for coming.
No
So
problem.
a bit of background about Cillian. His experience founding and leading a Big Four EMEA blockchain lab before joining AY, sorry, I do beg your pardon. Where he's a platform specialist in client onboarding and KYC, where he served as global head of digital and client solutions consulting as well as for DST systems. So you've got a wealth of experience building and co-founding blockchain labs. So we thought it'd be really interesting to understand from your experience what was going on. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Sure, thanks, Charles. Well, and hi, everybody. So as Charles said, my name is Cillian. I'm a director in technology consulting in EY here in Ireland. Prior to this, I worked for one of our Big Four competitors, where I was one of the co-founders and leads of their blockchain lab for EMEA. That was the first of their labs, and then we set up subsequent labs in APAC and in the US. And previous to that, I worked in Finergo, who were a client onboarding specialist. I've primarily focused there on digitizing their offering. So looking at what is the future of KYC, and aligned to that, then what is the future of identity, and how is identity going to merge with that whole KYC landscape to enable digital transformation in the banking space, but in I suppose, onboarding more broadly. And I suppose I was very lucky in my career. Before that, I worked for a company called DST Systems. DST were a company who don't exist anymore. They were bought by SS&C, but they were the first ever company in the US to buy a mainframe from IBM back in the late 60s. And what they did with that was they set up, it was part of Kansas Southern Railroad, if you can believe that, and they tracked railway carts and railway wagons across the US. And then what they said was, geez, this technology is interesting, a mainframe is interesting, why don't we track mutual funds with it? So they started tracking mutual funds, and then they started outsourcing that work. So if you have what's called an IRA or a 401k in the US, a big pension fund with mutual funds, the chances are they would have serviced about 90% of the servicing would have been done by that. But through that, they set up a technology company. The technology company did a couple of things. They did basic workflow, so a product called AWD, which was a BPM platform. And then they did two other platforms. One was called High Portfolio. So anybody who's been worked in the fund accounting industry will have heard of High Portfolio and how that's used for fund accounting. Then they developed a platform called ANOVA, and ANOVA was based on performance measurement and attribution of funds. So seeing where the investment return was being generated from. But what the experience gave me a wealth of understanding in terms of how processes worked within big financial institutions, how data was used, and then I guess how you would report on that data to gain insight from it. And whilst I was working for them, I was very fortunate. I was offered the role to lead sales in Southeast Asia. So I moved out to Singapore for 2 years. And whilst in Singapore, I was out in a bar one night and I saw a Bitcoin ATM. This was 2013. And I didn't have a clue what a Bitcoin was. And I didn't have a clue what a Bitcoin ATM was. And I looked at this machine, and being the green Irish was, green in every sense of green, I asked him, do I need to pay for the pints here using this Bitcoin thing? And I didn't have a clue. And I went home and I read about it, and I thought, because the asset servicing industry I was working in at the time, and the type of I suppose position that they have where you rely on trust of an intermediary, I thought to myself, wow, if this Bitcoin and this blockchain behind it can work, effectively you've killed that industry. So when I moved home to Ireland, I got more involved and got more engaged in Bitcoin and blockchain, and then I focused probably more on blockchain. I really took a shine to Ethereum. And through my work with my former employer, I was offered some fantastic chances. And one of those was to go to a hackathon in Shanghai in very early 2016, where I was a co-judge in a hackathon with Vitalik Buterin. And talk about out of my depth. I was just like, holy cow. So yeah, we had some absolute blockchain royalty at that. We were sponsored by Wangshan Labs. All the big names were there. And then through that, then we just got to develop. And through my career, I've worked with some fantastic people, from very senior people at VChain to meeting the guy at Chainlink to working with R3, with Ethereum, whatever it is. We've kind of done it all. So what I wanted to do today is, a lot of the time when I meet blockchain people or when I hear about blockchain, I suppose I really get this kind of front-on charge from technology. What I want to do today is, I'm a sales guy, right? I'm not a technologist. I'm a business consultant and a management consultant. What I want to do today was really share some of the insights that I've had from projects that I would have done, very much from the business perspective and understanding operations and kind of that side of the business and strategy, as opposed to technology. So I want to walk through kind of some of my thoughts about where I think projects with blockchain fail or at least can be enhanced. So hopefully you'll take some messages from the presentation, and you'll really get some benefit out of it. So what I would just want to talk about really is just success factors for blockchain projects. So let me just minimize that. So hopefully you can see my first slide, and this is probably my first rule of blockchain. And my first rule is don't major on blockchain with a client. If you're meeting operational people, if you're meeting business people, they have absolute lethargy around blockchain. They've heard it all before. And they've heard every probably possible story from you're going to be able to this is the future to whatever else. And a lot of the times the message is probably true, but I think there's just a natural skepticism about it. And that skepticism still persists within the C-suite. So I know IDC did some research and they suggested in Europe in particular, only about 18% of companies are adopting. And that's where a POC is included in adoption. So really, really low levels. The second thing I would say is that attached to that, there has been some recent, I suppose, evidence to suggest from another of the big four's blockchain survey that it still hasn't taken off. In particularly, digital identity isn't there yet. There are still concerns around regulatory requirements. Consortia are probably more focused on governance as opposed to actually operating. And they see, I suppose, a requirement, but as I say, it's just not there yet. So I think that's one thing. There's natural skepticism. The second thing I would say is that the so-called blockchain community has been blighted, I would say, by people who either just don't understand the capability or don't understand the technology, or who are just so linked to that crypto legacy and that context of, rapid return and whatever else, that probably I suppose the credibility of the community has been eaten into a little bit. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed or needs to be looked at. I think the other piece is that blockchain a lot of the time is spoken about as this panacea, that it's going to change the world, that it's going to resolve every ill under the sun. What I would say is if you really want to engage with the clients and if you really want to be truthful and as honest as you can, I think you also have to be able to put up your hand and say, guys, there are times when blockchain just will not make sense for you. If you just need a single database with basic movements of data between your own siloed business departments, just use a database. Just use whatever the system is by whoever it's made by. And I think that'll just help with that credibility. And I think finally that the language of blockchain creates a natural barrier to business people. And what I mean by that is if I sit with technical people who are very savvy on blockchain, I will hear words that a lot of the time I don't understand myself, or I just, that they just don't resonate with me. So I things like practical Byzantine fault tolerance. I hear things like, ZK snarks. And I'm like, what in the name of God? And if I'm thinking that, and I've been immersed in the community for years, I'm really trying to put myself in the position of someone on the other side of the table who's, maybe a COO or a head of strategy or a head of digital transformation. And they're just sitting there and they have less of a clue in many instances. So I think that's just really to be aware of. So as I say, the first rule of blockchain is probably don't major on blockchain with the client. Think of the business problem that they're facing. Think of the context that they're in. And I would say, think about digital transformation, talk to things like customer experience, and then being able to assert how the technology itself can help with those areas, because I think that'll probably ring true with them a little bit more. So that'll probably be my first observation. My second observation is that, the chasm still hasn't been crossed. Okay, so this is a Geoffrey Moore's model of crossing the chasm. So he talks about innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the laggards, etc. There's still been no killer app to date. And I suppose only the blockchain is what Bitcoin or Ethereum as the killer apps, even though I think that they're brilliant myself. Now, again, someone sitting on the other side of the table might not see that. The technology does still remain nascent. Its total cost of ownership is difficult to calculate. And this is particularly relevant now in that world of COVID. COVID-19 has caused businesses to contract in every possible way. We're facing into a recession. We're facing into all these challenges. Do I think we'll see the V that has been imagined in terms of the rebound? Probably not. I think it's probably going to be more of a tail. But this means that businesses need to be more sure than ever of their total costs. And I think the ability to present that from a blockchain perspective still remains that little bit difficult. It's not like walking into a customer, with an SAP technology or Microsoft or whoever it is and being able to say, yes, a license is going to cost you $100 a year per seat. You're going to need 500 seats. On top of that, then there's a support and maintenance fee of a platinum model of 10,000 a year or whatever it is. It's just not that easy. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at and reviewed. And I know with some of the new developments that different alliances or different technologies, platforms are looking at, that is changing. But I think that is something you've just got to be aware of. People really want certainty, particularly when they're making those investment decisions, and particularly when it comes to procurement of a solution. So I just say bear that in mind. Again, the third point there is budgets. Budgets at the moment are being held by digital customer compliance people, and that was pre the crisis. So if the budget is being held by them, align to them. Really align your message and your marketing and your brand to them on the basis of, this is how we're going to, digitally improve your business. This is how we're going to improve your customer experience. Yes, we've taken compliance considerations into account and going to enable them by doing this, as opposed to, as I mentioned earlier, leading with technology. And I would say also that solutions to date have been a bit like fintech. And what I mean by that is there aren't many fintechs out there who have really reimagined the world. There's only a handful, and they are the real killer apps. A lot of the fintech out there is just trying to replace something that exists today. They're at what I would call the fringes of innovation. So I think you really need to reimagine. And I think you need to be able to reimagine that vision and present such a compelling story of how you think the future is going to look, operate, and be put in place. I think that'll give you more credibility as well, just really thinking outside the box like that and actually presenting on that basis. So reimagine a new world. And what do I mean by that, reimagine a new world? Well, what I would suggest is that I often bring things, and I mentioned it at the start, in my early days of my career, I focused on a BPM platform around processing, which was around Lean Six Sigma. What I would say is don't be two-dimensional in design. Everything at the moment is really two-dimensional. And what I mean by that is we're looking at current value chains as linear processes. But as we know, a blockchain is a network. It's a solution that's been designed to be interoperable across all different participants, with multiple different facets of concern, but also value sharing, etc. So what I would say is don't design a linear step or a linear chain and be very myopic in that design. What I would say is design in a way which is even 3 or 4 dimensional. Really think about how a network is going to participate. And if you think about yourself in that network, what we do in a linear process is we only think of a single customer. Actually, when you look at that from a 3D or a 4D perspective, you notice that there are multiple customers within that chain, or within that ecosystem. And I think really, really focus on that. And that's a big departure. That is a big change, because when you look at something two-dimensionally, as I say, you're just going from left to right. It's what the fintechs or what a lot of the early blockchain companies have done. They've tried to look at that left to right process, and they've taken out 1 step, or they've taken out 2 steps in it. Actually, what you should be doing is completely changing the imagination to look at it from a perspective of a network and what you can build around it, and how you're going to facilitate a distribution of value or a distribution of commerce around that. So I would really, really say, don't be two-dimensional in design, really focus on this 3D world. So what I mean by that is, if you're one-dimensional, two-dimensional, you can see here 3 and 4. So each participant in the network will have individual needs and requirements. So getting the value chain on board is extremely challenging. And it's challenging because traditionally, a lot of these people would have been in a very adversarial relationship. So I think your ability to be able to go to the table, having thought through some of those challenges that are going to come in terms of what is the network going to look like, what is the interaction going to be between them, those usually adversarial parties who are looking to gain margin off each other, how are you going to work and facilitate those in a network? I think that the second piece there is, who will fulfill the different roles within the network, and what does that mean, and what do open standards mean across that network? What is the role of a future party? And one of the things, if we go back to the early days of blockchain and kind of some of the kind of the commercial anarchy that went with it was, the banks were going to be deceased, or this was going to kill banks. But actually, maybe when you look at it from a network perspective, in that 3D or that 4-dimensional design, actually you start to see where they could play a place. Maybe they won't, maybe they will, but you can start seeing a very different world. So, for example, could they become a custodian, which was their original job back in the days of banks and bank robbers and whatever else? The next point there is that each participant will be a customer of the network in some shape or form. So by the very nature of being in a network, you're going to participate in it. So you are going to be a provider to someone, but you're also going to be a consumer from someone else. So really think about everybody being your customer in that network. And then the final point is probably key, fairness and transparency, to respect the disparate needs within that is going to be really important. So the way I sum up this whole 3D or 4D world is a phrase I've been coining now for a while. It's called decentralized customer outcomes. How do you decentralize customer outcomes, but yet achieve multiple outcomes in a network setting at any one time for these decentralized parties? I think that's really a key to blockchain in the future. I think being able to think about that and really, really get to grips with that from that network perspective, as opposed to that linear way, is really important. So that would just be another of the probably point 4 that I would take from my projects. The 5th point I would say is that you need to converge to the present. So as much as you need to be 3D and 4D and all that, you do have to start with your position in the real world, right? So the new world needs to be presented as a viable alternative or the next stage of evolution. What we're not saying to customers, or what I have found to be successful with customers, is don't tell them that everything they have today needs to be thrown in the bin. Actually, just give them that path by saying, okay, guys, well, if we did this and if we connected this, that's going to get us to here. And then by doing this next step, it brings us to this evolution, or this transformative journey. And I think that's where you can start picking off current pain points where value can be demonstrated. But what I would say is that if you are creating value and you are looking to demonstrate it, make sure you measure it. You've really got to measure it, because you've got to be able to take that, particularly from a proof of concept or from a pilot. You've got to be able to take the data and then go up the chain, whether that's to a CFO or a CEO, and you've got to be able to prove, right, we looked at this challenge, we bolted on some technology here, we connected old systems. Yes, they worked. We used, oracles or whatever it was to be able to connect to the data sources. And actually we bridged and we made a path to the future. And by doing that, we saved X amount of dollars. We created a new customer experience. We overcame traditional challenges that you had never faced. And this meant the processing went from 5 days down to 1 day. And here's the dollar amount associated with all of that. You've got to be able to do that. So it sounds like a basic hygiene factor, but you would be shocked how many blockchain projects, proof of concepts, pilots, engagements with startups that I've seen across the globe that they have not done this. And it's been to their detriment, because they can have all dancing, all singing software. But you've got to remember the guy or the lady on the other side of the table has to make an investment decision. On the left-hand side, they're going to have something from the likes of an SAP or a traditional vendor. It's going to say, my total cost of ownership is going to be X. On the other page, you have Y, which is the blockchain-based solution. We don't know the total cost of ownership today, but, and that's where the but has to come in, you have to have that ability to be able to prove where the value is and what that means. So as I say, only by aligning to a current business problem or challenge will you get that support. So really think about Trojan horses and what you could do for your business to be able to develop that Trojan horse. So I would suggest that. Again, it might sound simple, but you'd be shocked how many times I've seen firms not do this or just not think about it. The next thing I would say is, don't think you can do it all yourself. Okay, I think there's a little bit here about maybe humility, but also just about kind of being a little bit realistic. And again, I hope I'm not teaching people to suck eggs here, but you'd be surprised how many times I've seen firms not do this. So what I would say is that deploying a network, it is a hugely complex endeavor. From what I've seen in my role, the technology, I wouldn't say it's the easy bit, but it's an easier bit sometimes than the highly complex requirements around change management, governance, bringing adversaries together on a platform with a shared capability. That is really, really tough, particularly if you're in a regulated industry like banking or financial services more broadly. The second thing I'd say is, if the blockchain is appropriate, it should only ever be a work stream of a larger program of works. So what I mean by that is, you should probably have a work stream around the customer and their experience. You will probably need some sort of a work stream around the governance and how the platform is going to run. You'll probably need another one around data privacy and security. There'll probably be around compliance more broadly with regulation. And then there's the technology ones, of which blockchain should be one. So I would say, don't limit yourself and just going in and saying, oh, we have a technology out of the box that can do this. I think that really underestimates your own value, but also, again, eats into that credibility piece. So the next piece I would say is, to be deployed a production solution, it requires a plethora of skills and capabilities. I think that goes without saying. Whether it's technology, risk, compliance, all those different requirements that are needed. And I think collaboration and working across traditionally competitive divides requires new skills and tool sets. That was a big one I found, working the political nature of some of the industries that I've worked in. We did a big piece of work last year in the food industry, where we were dealing with firms of a similar ilk, but the politics between them was just incredible. And again, just having the emotional intelligence and I think the program management and the capabilities to be able to manage that. Again, I just wouldn't understate it. I put in a quote from Marcus Aurelius there, that which is not good for the swarm, neither is it good for the bee. I think it's just a good one to bear in mind. But again, it's complex, it's multidisciplinary, it's a highly collaborative environment. People are not used to doing this. People are very much used to being within their own silos, within organizations and businesses. The exception are those big technology companies and those big social media companies who've probably been, working on the fringes a little bit more, or those companies who have a very advanced innovation policy or innovation capability, in that they might have innovation labs and they may be used to doing this. The traditional businesses, they have none of that infrastructure. They don't have any of that. I wouldn't say none of the skills, but they would definitely wouldn't be as developed in their culture to be able to facilitate that and to be able to work with you on that. So really just bear that in mind and bring that to bear on the project. Point number 7 then was, as I say, and I said this earlier, is design and context. The other piece that you have to be really conscious of is regulation as well. So the first one I would say is that the vast majority of CTOs and COOs, there can't been previous and ongoing investment, right? These guys and ladies, you're really asking them in many ways to rock the boat. And if I'm a COO and I'm, 55, 60, I'm coming up to retirement, I'm on stock options and I'm on whatever else, why would I rock the boat for you, right? You've got to make it really compelling for me. Why should this be building a legacy for me, but also building the future for my organization? Really, really think about it from their perspective. And also then how you're going to enable them to go to that new world by migrating to the future or by transitioning to the future as opposed to this big bang approach. Because the big bang a lot of the time won't wash with them. If a COO has invested 10, 20, 100 million on whatever platform it is over the last 10, 20 years, again, you've got to make it easy for them. The second thing I would say is to deploy new capability, you need to align with existing infrastructure or alternatively a greenfield approach. And if you are going on that greenfield approach, make sure you have dedicated budget and make sure it's being signed off. Because if it hasn't, I would walk. In fact, I wouldn't walk, I would run for the hills because you're entering trouble territory. So really just align to existing infrastructure. As I say, if it is a greenfield approach, just make sure there's budget, there's sign off, and know who your decision makers are and how you can affect or at least have a relationship with them. If you don't have a relationship with them, again, you need to consider your participation in the project. The third point there is just around the regulatory paradigm, right? Not be overlooked. Just because we have some of the greatest ideas of how we could, become the future of whatever industry it is, that doesn't mean that, the whole world is going to migrate to it overnight. Any solution needs to comply with the existing regulatory requirements and the existing regulatory paradigm. And again, I can't overstate that enough. I think a really good example of this was, there was a story going around a few years ago about a aviation aircraft lessor. They created a token or a coin that was going to be used to sell, I think it was a Boeing 787 or a 777 for fractional ownership. You could buy a token. And I think they received about 250 million in funding for that aircraft. They weren't able to cash in the 250 million. Why? Because they didn't do the basic thing you need to do when opening an account in financial services. They didn't do the KYC. So because they didn't know who the investors were, they could never cash in their money. Why? Because they would have been sued, or they wouldn't have been sued, they would have been fined for money laundering or potential money laundering activities. So again, just really think about the paradigm that you exist in and sit in. I think the final point there is that, strategic decisions will need to be made in relation to the legal governance framework, the network capability. You need to think about simple things. What's the tax domicile? What's the legal structure? What sort of incorporation are you going to have? These might sound like boring, areas or kind of to be overlooked sometimes because you just want to get on with design and build. And I understand that. Believe me, I get as excited about these projects as anybody else. But just sometimes you got to, sometimes you have to take that step back, and you just have to look at, what are the broader consequences? What are the bigger pieces that we really need to consider? And as I say at the bottom, the regulatory paradigm, that won't change just because you've had a great idea. It may over time, but in the short term, it won't. And you've got to remember that that's a picture of the central bank in Ireland. Their number one job is to protect people, to protect an economy. So you've got to really think about that. Point number 8 then is give yourself every chance of success. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Basics again, program management, hygiene around it, your budget management, being realistic. Don't overpromise, don't underdeliver. Have access to the right sponsors, the decision makers who can move the dial when needed. And as I say at the end, make sure you have the sponsor at the very highest level. Again, I can't underestimate that. One tool I've used throughout my career is a form of selling. It's called strategic selling. It's a framework that was developed by an organization called Miller Hyman. And it literally maps out stakeholders, the relationship that you have with them, what you need to be able to do to affect. And I really like that idea of really thinking about your stakeholders, mapping them, and then managing them and temperature checking them over the life and the course of a project. Again, it's just going to really help you, because ultimately, if you're doing a POC or a proof or a pilot, you want to get the next level. You want to get the next step up in investment. So you just got to really think about, having all of those on board. And it goes back to that earlier point of just making sure that the business case is there, that everything has been done. So hopefully that one makes sense. Point number 9 is it's a relation of mine. He has this saying that it's always about the money. He's been in banking for a very long time, but it is always about the money, right? That's a sad reality. So your success for future phases is going to depend on the ability to articulate its value and impact. No doubt about that. Second thing, put yourself in the shoes of those signing off. Be able to articulate the cost, the benefits, and the risk. Also think about the actual process you're going to have to go through to get it signed off, right? Typically, you're going to go to the business. They're going to push you to procurement. If there is going to be an RFP, you want to be writing the RFP. If you're not writing the RFP, you're probably making up the numbers. And the other piece is always put in a little bit of buffer, because procurement have to do their job. And what does that mean? A couple of percentage points in terms of a haircut, usually. So I would say really, really think about that, and just, buffing out there a little bit. I would also say that the competition in most instances will be traditional vendors who have clear total cost of ownership models and who can invest now for the future wins. The other thing I haven't spelled out there, but maybe it's implicit, is also your competition is internal. You'll have internal IT folks who say, we can do this, we can do, we can make something together with a basic database, we can do whatever it is. Particularly in the bigger organizations, some of the large financial institutions, they'll have their own innovation teams, they'll have their own technology teams. In many instances, their technology organizations will be vast. We're talking thousands of people. So really just think about them and how you interact with them. And I would say finally, just don't underestimate the importance of this area, about being about the money. And as I say, just being able to articulate that business value and cost. The final point then, I think, is really about being able to cope with the uncertain and being prepared for those uncomfortable moments, because you will invariably need to pivot. It's funny, I'm in the middle of an innovation project at the moment where exactly this requirement has come about in terms of pivoting. And I think that is one of probably the most important things in this space, because it is such nascent technology, because new capabilities are coming on stream throughout the life of projects, because there's such an amount of development going on at any one time. I think, just being flexible, being agile is key, albeit within the confines of being able to manage budgets and project timeframes, etc. So I think fail fast and learn faster, pivot if you need to. I think the soft skills are essential to this, and people are advocates will help you cross the chasm. Not a ZK snark. So really think about the people. I think empathy and emotional intelligence, they're absolutely critical. And again, probably for technologists in particular, a lot of these skills are traditionally difficult because maybe technologists are that a little bit more analytical at times than people who are more customer facing or whatever it is. So I would just say, really bear that in mind. That there will be uncomfortable moments. It's a good sign, and I think also you should embrace those moments of being uncomfortable, because that's when you're really being challenged, and that's actually where you can come into your own, because the technology so well, what it can do. But at the same time, just take the lead from the business people, because they'll know how to navigate these channels. So I'd say that. So that's probably my top 10 kind of lessons or areas. These, as I say, have been developed over, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 projects in blockchain at this stage, working with some of the biggest organizations on the planet in terms of trying to put this into place. And also with some of the most interesting brains and probably the smartest people in blockchain when it comes to this. So very happy to share these. Hopefully you found them useful. I'm happy to take any questions, Charles, if there are. But as I say, hopefully people have found that useful.
Well, firstly, I found it incredibly useful. I've got a smart contract development company, and we've come across quite a lot of these challenges already, particularly the politics, the realities of blockchain, what it can actually do, the language people are using. All these points that you hit were very salient as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
I find it a massive challenge. So how many, going on your information, how many of our clients or prospective clients have already been burnt by either someone promising the world with blockchain, or even coming up with complicated language that just confuses C-suite individuals?
Yeah, I would say, God, in terms of the complicated language, I would say the vast majority. I would say they always have to say, in the middle of meetings, and you'll see this in meetings even, just guys, time out there, let's really understand, what does that actually mean? Can you describe it? Where I find, what I find really helpful in those instances is actually people who are visual. If you can get up and you can draw it, instead of just describing it, actually get up and draw and say, right, this is what the process looks like. This is what's actually happening at this stage. Party A is over here, party B is over here. We're putting this capability in the middle between us, and that's going to allow us to talk in a way where we're going to do whatever it is. It's just an example, but I would say that's very high. In terms of customers who've been burnt, again, I would say high, and that's why I think you see so many proof of concepts and then nothing. That's probably the main reason for that. Probably a nice little story I can tell you about kind of that whole idea though of language is probably a mistake I made myself. So when I joined Finergo, the CEO is a guy called Mark Murphy, fantastic guy, really, really clever. And he had this idea around putting together capability for a KYC platform and really specializing on it. So what he said he always wanted to be was kind of the Lamborghini, the Ferrari of the KYC world. And I remember going to him and I'm saying, yeah, but the future of your organization isn't going to be a platform. Actually, the future of your organization is taking all the rules from global KYC requirements, putting them into smart contracts, making that smart contract layer available to the whole world, and then that being used with identities and smart contracts and actually, can I onboard? And he was like, and he used to call me Chesney. He said, Chesney, what are you talking about? I don't get it. And then we broke it down. And I said, so really what's going to happen with KYC? You're going to go from a model from know your customer to asking a customer to prove their identity or prove your identity, PYI. And he just became an advocate of it over about, I would say it took me about 8-9 months to get there. But when you bring people on the journey and they get it, they really become advocates and they start singing about it. But it's just that language. But as I say, what helped me in that situation with him was just drawing, and getting up and showing him, but being able to tie it back to his world, and really being able to say, right, this is the way it's done today. These are the challenges. This is what the future looks like. And I actually had this discussion a couple of weeks ago. I was talking to a customer who's looking to build an identity platform at the moment. And I said, why do you need to build an identity platform? She said, well, we want to look at how we could be the future of identity. But I said, there is no future to identity. You need a wallet, which is available today. It's called MetaMask. You need a token infrastructure, which is available today. You need a smart contract. And then you need to be able to move data across those smart contracts to be able to prove whatever it is you want to prove. So I said, why are you building a platform? He was like, I said, you need to participate in one. You don't need to build one. And I think also just having that kind of ability to be able to say something like that, having the experience in the pocket, and being able to spell that out as opposed to codding them. I mean, I could have taken money off the table there. I could have said, oh yeah, I'll build you one. It's going to cost you X amount of money. But I think it's just having that practicality and foresight to say, actually, you know what, this is the better option. This is the way it needs to work, as opposed to doing that. Just really, really being credible again. Back to that point around credibility. Yeah.
To go off that point there, so say if a C-suite individual were to come to you and say, look, I'm incredibly bullish on blockchain. I think it is the future. I want a blockchain. I need one now. Build me one. How would you react to a statement like that?
I'd ask why. because what you don't want is to lead with a solution. What you need to do is understand, one, a business problem, where's the fit, what's the value creation, and then also you need to ask and break down that problem into what is the ecosystem around that problem. And it goes back to that concept that I have around decentralized customer outcomes. What are the outcomes you want to achieve with that platform? But I would be highly skeptical if someone was coming to me with just, I need to build a blockchain. I'd be like, oh God. Maybe I'd push him onto one of my competitors, because I know what a drain he'd be on them, or she would be on them. Yeah.
Are you seeing any difference in the adoption of public or private blockchains? Are you finding your clients moving towards one rather than the other?
So, I mean, in EY, I mean, we've been very open about this. We support fully public, decentralized blockchain. We think that is the way forward. Anything else is a hybrid. That's our position, and I agree. What I think, though, is that there is a challenge around what is the injury step. I think maybe for example, for proof of concept or something like that, you maybe would do it in a private setting just to give people that comfort. But I think always the goal should be fully decentralized, fully public. I think that is what makes most sense. It'd be like building a motorway around Dublin and saying only private cars can use it who join a club. That's just stupid, it just makes no sense. So I think that's a challenge. But I think, again, it goes back to that idea of, are people comfortable with the technology? Are there concerns? And I think the further you bring them on a journey and the more comfortable you make them with the technology, the easier to have that discussion. But I think from day one, your focus should be fully, permissionless. Absolutely.
Absolutely brilliant. I completely agree with that. We've got a couple of questions just come in via YouTube.
Sure.
Eric Neverson asks, has the pandemic taught you anything worthy of applying to your business has the pandemic taught you anything worthy of applying your business to your business processes? Not quite English, but yeah. Has the pandemic taught anything?
I would say two things. So the first one is, I think COVID has had a very interesting impact in terms of digital transformation more broadly. I think it is a catalyst in so many ways. And I think people are now looking at how they create value more fundamentally. And I think new technologies now have a part to play in that. The second thing is, I wouldn't call it desperation, but there is certainly a feeling out there that we need to find the most appropriate solutions to be able to solve problems. I think it has shone a light actually on blockchain in terms of what it can do. And I particularly look at it from the perspective of health and identity. People are hugely challenged at the moment in terms of contact tracing, in terms of finding out who has a virus, who's been tested, who hasn't been tested. We were talking about that idea earlier of certificates for COVID. If people are moving internationally, I think you can start to see the use cases where the technology is now coming into its own. So I think that catalyst piece has been there. But again, I'd caveat it hugely on the basis that budgets are going to be really under pressure at the moment. So there's that trade-off. But I think there has probably never been a better time to talk about it. The other thing I would say is that has surprised me, and this is probably more to the aspect of the crypto world. I've actually been surprised at the level of fluctuation in the likes of the cryptocurrencies. I thought personally, I really thought Bitcoin would take off actually, because I thought people would use it as a real safe haven asset. I have been shocked in the way the financial markets have kind of rebounded. So I think there's probably something in that as well. But maybe that will change if we did go into a prolonged recession. We might see more of a switch. But I do think it's interesting that at least it is entering the debate now. The people are saying, well, what about alternatives? What about digital assets? What about different ways of doing things? So as I say, it goes back to that point of being a catalyst. One other thing I suppose I would see from our own business is the idea of that whole attestation-based model. And is that actually a future for a lot of the businesses that we deal with, within the ecosystem more broadly? What is their position in the value chain? Does it become as an attestation provider? And actually, could some of the governments around the world who are going to have these huge deficits on the basis of, having to deal with COVID and clean up from COVID, actually, could they start creating attestation-based models where they start charging for their attestations, because they are the ultimate holders of truth in many situations for particularly personal data. So, I think there's opportunity there, but it's too early to tell still. I mean, I think in 6 to 9 months' time we'll have a better view. Hopefully that helps, Eric.
Yeah, I think it will. I think it will. I'm quietly bullish on Bitcoin as well.
Yeah.
Hopefully it does some fun things in the future. I like wrapped BTC as well. That's fascinating. So we've got another question. When will we see smart contract adoption within industries outside of decentralized finance, such as banking or trade finance? That's from Vector.
Yeah. I suppose how long? Well, if I knew that question, I'd be backing it all day, right? I mean, if I knew the answer there, I'd be investing in whatever platform it is, right? And I'd be going after it strong. What I would say is we have definitely seen a change in the last even year, 2 years. If I go back on my career, right, 2015, 2016, when we were talking to clients about blockchain, it was about education. It was really about what is blockchain, what does it do, what does it mean, blah, 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 blah. 2017 was probably around proof of concept. It was probably the year of the POC. 2018, probably the year of the pilot. 2019, then I would say we've got into the kind of the areas of governance in terms of the areas of really looking at what it means to be a decentralized organization, or start looking at the ways of doing things in a new manner. I think late 2020, 21, 22, I think that's when we'll start to see the mainstream adoption of the technology. And I think as we see the mainstream adoption, the most obvious piece and use case for me within that is smart contracts. Because effectively, if you think about business workflow today relies on things: one process, two rules. Okay, we have the processing engine now in the likes of Ethereum. That's it. It's decentralized. It's available. It's out there. What's the next logical step? Rules, because rules give logic. Logic gives information. Information gives outcomes. If you can do that, that's the tipping point. That's where the value of this whole platform and capability is. What I would love to start seeing is those organizations who make rules engines available, or the vendors who supply rules engines, whether it's for a KYC, whether it's for whatever it is, why don't they start putting that capability into the contract layers on the decentralized platforms? That's what makes sense to me. They'll make more money off them in the long run. And that was something I worked on with DNVGL. So DNVGL would have been a big customer of mine previously. They did a lot of work. I was on the VChain platform. And their view was that actually, if they started creating this, and this is all in the public domain, by the way, so I'm not sharing anything out of school. But their view of the world was that if we can supply the certification model within the decentralized environments, and if you can start putting contracts around that so that you, right, this certificate was revoked, tell the insurance company now that the insurance should be terminated. There's value in that. There's value in that for the insurance company, but there's also value in that for them. Why? Because they can start taking a click or a basis point off the insurance company for consuming that information. So I think they just need to change their business models. Now, that's easier said than done. That's the challenging bit. So smart contracts, when will they come into their own? When do I hope they come into their own? I think we're starting to see it. I think it's just a matter of those businesses looking at their traditional business and operating models, seeing the future, and then moving and predicting that move and getting ahead of it. As I say, DNV did very well. And I remember sitting in a session there one day and just having some light bulb moments go off in my head where I was like, holy cow, these guys, if they do this right, will ultimately make money from their competitors today. And that was the light bulb moment for me. And it was just like, wow, that's smart. So I think that's going to be the challenge. So yeah, I suppose 18, 24 months, I guess. It just depends. I think one tipping point that could change this is a decentralized identity, which was fully self-sovereign, came into being, particularly in relation with COVID. I think that could be a huge catalyst. If you could have rules around that, link it to geospatial awareness or whatever it is, to tell people you've been exposed, you haven't been exposed, you can't travel now because your token has been revoked because you were in close proximity to a known case or whatever it was. That could be a tipping point. Who knows? As I say, I'd be betting big if I knew.
Yeah, no problem. I think we're all betting big, to be honest. So how will this impact auditing or assurance industry, since blockchain is an immutable ledger? Will we see significant reductions in SOX requirements?
I'm not an auditor. I wish I knew the answer. But what I do know is that whilst I have been in the organizations that I've been in, they've both been looking at the future of audit more broadly. And what is the future of audit? Maybe it is actually to look at the assurance on transactions on maybe that becomes the the future of their role, the future of their job. I think it's just going to be a mitigation or a migration of their role. Same with the lawyer. What is the future role of a lawyer? This is an interesting one for me. My background is that I did a degree in law, and I looked at jurisprudence. And one of the things about jurisprudence is there was a federal movement in the US in the 50s and 60s where they looked at the law as a machine, and this whole concept that you put in the factors, the results get spat out. And again, you could have that scenario apply here. The big difference between a smart contract and traditional justice today is that it's proactive. You know what's going to happen, whereas justice today is primarily retrospective. That something's happened, you're suing, or there's litigation. So, but again, does that mean that the role of a solicitor will no longer exist or no longer be required? No, it just means that what they'll probably do is they'll work out the future potential of a contract going wrong way before the contract is entered to, and they'll write that into the terms of a smart contract. And then they'll be able to say, okay, if Ryanair reneges on the purchase of its 10,000 liters of avgas or whatever it is, we're not going to do this, or we are going to do that, as opposed to now where you'd have a situation, right, Ryanair didn't pay, we're in a default situation or whatever it is, and now we need to do this legislation as an example. So I think it just changed the nature of the role. Very interestingly, though, the legal firms in the UK have started hiring technologists, and they have started hiring coders. Why? Because they see the future being in smart contracts. In the audit land, what we will just see is blockchain assurance and blockchain advisory, again, to look at those different roles and those different jobs. Just a different variance, different view of their lens. But yeah, I mean, you would think that a lot of the requirement would go down from the traditional world.
Fantastic. A couple more, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, walk away.
Yeah. What do you think is missing at the moment in order to get a big shift the World Economic Forum is talking about, i.e. transition from the traditional system to blockchain tech?
What's missing? Ooh, probably the burning platform question, isn't it? I mean, it's what is that burning issue that we need, and why do we need it? And what is it that has so failed in the world today? Now, a lot of us would probably be able to articulate what we think has failed in the world today. Whether the powers that be want to accept that or not is another thing. So there's probably a bit of that. I also think there's probably still something around the nascent nature of the technology itself. As I say, it is relatively unproven in production. That doesn't mean that it's not the right technology. That doesn't mean that the capability isn't there. It's just unproven. And again, if you look at the kind of the economic world that we're in, the post-crisis world that we're in today, what do people want? They want safety. So it's going to be a very brave person who makes that decision to move to that new technology set or landscape or whatever it is. So I think that's probably what it needs. The other thing I would like to see more broadly is collaboration. Where I think we've probably failed, or at least we haven't been as engaged as we could be, is actually looking at that kind of 3D or 4D model and actually seeing who could participate around that network and what would it mean to people, as opposed to being in that world where we're just taking a step out of a process or whatever it is. I don't think, because that's been articulated well enough, it hasn't been collaborated upon. I think if the collaboration was upon that basis and then people got around the table and agreed that actually this makes sense, I think then you'd be in a very different world. But I think that is a problem at the moment. So we probably haven't seen enough collaboration. What I would like to also see is probably more of an inclusion of blockchain initiatives in different innovation criteria as well. So like within countries, there'll be innovation funds, there'll be different initiatives from governments, from big organizations. It would be nice to see some of those really focused on the technology itself, and actually, with defined budgets, with defined scope, to be able to do that testing, to be able to do all those different pieces. I think one of the sad things about the world that we're in is just the ad hoc and the sporadic nature a lot of the time of initiatives. That we're going to do something in a knee-jerk reaction, like we're going to set up this lab or we're going to set up this capability, but no one ever really thinks through, right? Well, what happens beyond the lab, or what happens beyond the proof of concept or the pilot? I think there's probably a little bit more broader thinking that needs to be done there. And if I had to put my money on it, I would say we'll probably see that sort of capability coming from those more advanced economies who have that foresight. And I'm particularly thinking about places like Singapore, the Middle East, where they just seem to have that longer term view and they're prepared to put their money behind it and say, right, let's give this a test. Hopefully it works. If it doesn't, we'll learn lessons along the way. But I think you need more of that. And the other thing that's going to happen is that if those countries do those things, let's just take an example. If Singapore was to set up a fully decentralized exchange for equities, not just security tokens or whatever it was, if they could do, full trading through this, and they were able to bring down the cost to those asset managers and the cost to those companies who are looking to sell their equities on that platform, and they could beat everybody else around the world by 90%, I guarantee you, every other country then around the world would be spending as much as they can to catch up. So I think that's going to be part of the tipping point. But that moment has to come, and until that comes, we won't be playing catch up. So, yeah.
Okay, final one coming from Anon. Which industry? Well, actually, I'll add a caveat here. Do you think that the industries hit hardest by COVID would be the industries which could get most disrupted by blockchain technology?
No, if I think about airlines. So I don't think any blockchain is going to be able to fly you from Dublin to New York or Dublin to London. But I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a good question because if you think about it, those industries that are under most challenge, they are the ones that actually should be in it most now. The challenge is that they're also the ones who don't have, or who have most pressure on their spend at the moment. So I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is there are industries out there that will just continue to invest in the technology irrespective. I think where blockchain could play a huge role is probably more in areas where innovation to date has been limited and there's no set standard. What I mean by that is, you take equity trading, you take any sort of trading in financial markets, there's been systems there that have been developed, there's a whole ecosystem around them, there's data providers, all that type of stuff. You think about climate change, managing sustainability, those vendors aren't there. Or it's existing vendors trying to shoehorn capability in to be able to solve that problem. Actually, that's kind of a green field, pardon the pun, but actually that's an area where you could see innovation, because as I say, it's on the fringes, that hasn't really been, there aren't traditional legacy vendors in place. So they could be good. So I would say it'll probably be more areas like that. I think also there's a big requirement in terms of the new health requirements coming through. So if you look at cell and gene therapy, again, a very cutting edge area. Why wouldn't you move to that type of a solution as opposed to going with legacy when you're developing something so new and so nuanced, particularly when it gets into the idea of personalized medicine and personalized care. So probably sustainability, cell and gene therapy, or kind of the new advances in life sciences, that whole area of health certificates of identity. I would see those first, but yeah, great question. Who would I be positioning for if it was me and I was laying bets? I think definitely that sustainability piece. We're seeing that millennials want to be sustainable. We know that. There is huge pressure on governments around the world to be sustainable. The renewable energy companies who are really taking off. We've also seen some of the traditional boys. I think I read the other week, it was either BP or Shell, one of them, they said they were going to be completely carbon neutral by 2050 or something. It was one of those big companies. They're the obvious kind of candidates or factors. So yeah, great question.
You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure everyone else is in exactly the same boat. I can't wait to watch the video back again, to be perfectly honest. But sure. Thank you very much for coming on, Cillian. It's been really, really illuminating, and your experience is obvious. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Thanks, folks. Thank you, Charles.
Not a problem. Have a wonderful day, sir. And I think that's it, really.
You too.
Okay,
thanks, folks.
Thanks very much. See you in a bit. Bye-bye.
Bye.